Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing through the velvet-curtained corridors of Vatican history, where the scent of incense mingles with something a little more suspicious. You can hear distant chanting, the echo of sandals on marble, and somewhere, maybe in a hidden wine cellar, a cardinal is whispering a deal that definitely isn't in the Bible. The robes are embroidered, the rings are kissed, but underneath the silk and gold, oh, there's rot. Political rot, moral rot, the kind of rot that's too stubborn to wash out, even with holy water. And tonight, you're going to walk straight through it. Because we're talking about the worst popes in history. Not just mildly bad, not just oops, forgot to fast during Lent bad. No, we're diving into the kind of papal disasters that make you blink twice and mutter, wait, the Pope did what? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are in Rome. Not tourist Rome, not selfie at the Colosseum Rome. No, this is the 15th century, and the air is a heavy mix of candle smoke, garlic, and the faint metallic tang of old coins. You trudge down a stone alley barely wide enough for two monks to pass. On the right, a butcher shop. Flies dance in lazy spirals over something vaguely animal-shaped. On the left, an ornate door leads to a building with no sign, just a discreet carving of crossed keys. The symbol of the papacy. You're not just walking through a city, you're walking through a contradiction. Rome is holy and filthy, reverent and deeply corrupt. Papal banners flutter from balconies right above pickpockets. Inside the Vatican walls, debates on divine mercy echo down marble halls, while in secret, gold changes hands faster than Hail Marys in confession booths. This is the city of the Pope, and this is the city of popes gone wrong. Now let's be clear. Not every pope was a disaster. Some were spiritual, some were scholarly. Some genuinely tried their best to live out the teachings of Christ while managing a chaotic empire. But that's not why you're here, is it? You're here for the drama. For the popes who turned the Holy See into a holy mess. For the ones who put enemies on trial after they were dead. For teenage popes, warrior popes, wine-drunk popes, and popes who made nepotism into a papal hobby. And right now, as you glide silently into the heart of the Vatican, you begin to understand something important. The history of the papacy is not just about religion, it's about power. Earthly, ugly, backroom deal power. The popes were not just spiritual leaders, they were kings. Land-owning, army-commanding, money-wielding monarchs in fancy hats. Take a breath. You're surrounded by gold-leafed murals. The flickering candlelight makes the saints dance on the walls, but their eyes? They do not blink. They've seen things, terrible things. Things involving poisoned chalices and forged decrees and very, very awkward family dinners. A servant brushes past you carrying a decanter of wine so old it probably remembers Charlemagne. You glance down the hallway and see a cardinal adjusting his scarlet robes in front of a mirror, muttering to himself in Latin. Is he preparing for mass or for battle? Here's the kicker. The corruption didn't always wear a snarl. Sometimes it wore perfume, silken gloves, a warm, convincing smile. Sometimes the worst sins wore the softest shoes. Even in the early days, the papacy had its murky moments. Pope Marcellinus in the 3rd century allegedly sacrificed to pagan gods during the Diocletian persecutions. Historians still argue whether he actually did or whether the tale was retroactive slander. But it set a tone. Even the highest office in Christendom was not immune to whisper campaigns, questionable alliances, or flat-out backpedaling. And the further into the Middle Ages you go, the wilder it gets. By the time you hit the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, the papacy was a storm-tossed ship. Italian noble families treated the position like a family heirloom, passing the papal tiara around like it was a particularly shiny game of musical chairs. One faction would install a pope on Monday, another would overthrow him by Wednesday. Sometimes they did it literally with swords in the streets. You pause in front of a fresco. It shows St. Peter holding the keys to heaven, serene and powerful. But you swear that in the shadows of the paint, a second figure is drawn faintly behind him. A man in robes, yes, but with a dagger under his sash. Artistic accident? Or a whisper from a time when sainthood and scheming shared a bench? You sit for a moment on a worn marble bench in the Vatican garden. Olive trees rustle in the evening breeze. Somewhere, a nightingale sings. Peaceful, almost sacred, but even this garden has roots tangled with blood and bribery. A little-known fact. Several popes, even the really shady ones, were canonized later. Yep. Sainthood was not always about spiritual excellence. Sometimes it was about who you knew, who your family paid off, or whether the documents proving your miracles could be forged with enough convincing ink. One pope even declared a former pope a saint, while under the influence of his own mistress's family fortune. Quirky detail? In medieval times, the papal apartments were designed with secret escape routes. Not for security reasons against invading armies, no. Those routes were for slipping away from scandal. One door led to a wine cellar that connected to a bakery. Another passed behind a tapestry of St. Augustine and opened into the quarters of a well-known courtesan. You shift on the bench. Something scurries past your feet. You glance down, expecting a rat. Instead, it's a parchment. You pick it up. A list of names. All popes. Some with small notes beside them. Suspicious death. Nephew appointed cardinal at 14. Accused of simony. One line simply says, corpse trial, you'll get there soon. And, oh, will that be a ride. But for now, just know the story, it's not just about one corrupt pope here and there. It's about a pattern, a legacy, a centuries-long parade of silk-clad sinners and halo-polishing hypocrites who somehow convinced millions that they were the voice of God on earth, while using that voice to negotiate land deals, arrange marriages, and once allegedly commission a lion pit in the papal garden. Historians still argue whether that was a joke, a metaphor, or an actual lion pit. You really hope it was metaphorical mostly. So, as you stand, dusting off your robes and preparing to walk deeper into the cloistered heart of papal mischief, remember this. You're not just learning about history. You're visiting the world's weirdest job interview. A job where the perks include eternal salvation, diplomatic immunity, and occasional assassination attempts. And the disqualifications? Morals optional. Your next stop, a courtroom drama like no other. Bring your own gavel. You're not dreaming. You really are standing at the edge of a courtroom where the defendant is dead. Fully dead. Buried. Exhumed. And now dressed in papal robes again. Stiff fingers looped over a Bible he can't read. Mouth slack in eternal silence. You shift uncomfortably on the cold stone bench, because even though you came here for strange history, this might be a bit much even for your curiosity. This, dear listener, is the Cadaver Synod. And the star of the show? Pope Stephen VI. It's January of 897. The air in Rome is sharp and damp, smelling faintly of mildew, incense, and an uncomfortable mix of human ambition. You're in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the official cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope himself. But tonight it's less cathedral and more crime scene. In the front of the basilica, seated like a king of chaos, is Pope Stephen VI. He's in his 40s, tense as a pulled crossbow string, with deep eye bags that suggest he hasn't slept soundly in years. Power will do that to a man. He paces, he glares, he gestures wildly at the corpse propped up in the papal throne across from him. The defendant, in case you missed it, is Pope Formosus. Dead Pope Formosus. If you feel like asking, wait, how? Why? Who approved this? You're not alone. Historians still argue whether this trial was pure personal vengeance, A political purge? Or just Stephen completely losing it in the Vatican's echo chamber of paranoia? Here's the gossip. Formosus had been pope before Stephen. During his papacy, he made powerful enemies and even more questionable decisions. He'd invited a foreign king, Arnulf of Carinthia, to march into Rome and fix the city's noble feuds. That didn't go over well with local power families. Then he crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor, which really ruffled the feathers of a rival claimant. Lambert of Spoleto, a teen noble with more ego than experience. By the time Stephen came to power, Lambert and his very ambitious mother Agiltrude were back in control. And let's just say, Agiltrude hated Formosus with the fire of 1,000 burning heretic manuscripts. So, what better way to destroy your enemy's legacy than to put his corpse on trial? Publicly? In front of Rome. On a literal throne. You clutch your sleeves tighter. The air is colder here. Not from the weather, but from the sheer absurdity. Guards had dug up Formosus' body months after his burial. Rumors say it was already falling apart, a husk wrapped in decayed velvet. They redressed him in papal vestments, sat him upright, and brought him to court like the world's worst marionette. And now, Stephen is screaming at the corpse. Why did you usurp the See of Rome? Why did you violate canon law? Why did you serve as bishop while also being pope? The defense? Well, Formosus isn't saying much, so Stephen assigns a deacon to speak for him. That poor man stands next to the corpse and whispers barely audible responses like, "The defendant pleads," before trailing off. You really hope the deacon got a bonus, or at least a strong drink after this. The trial goes on for hours. Witnesses are summoned. Canon law is cited. The crowd grows larger, buzzing with disbelief. You hear whispers. What if the body moves? Isn't this sacrilege? I heard his toe fell off on the steps. Eventually, the verdict arrives. Guilty. Formosus is stripped of his papal garments. The fingers he used to bless the faithful, well, those are cut off. His body is dragged out, unceremoniously tossed into the Tiber River. Later rumors say fishermen pulled it out and reburied it, respectfully this time. But by then the damage was done. Here's the twist. This wasn't the end of Stephen's power play. It was his undoing. The people of Rome were not thrilled. The clergy was horrified. Even hardened nobles muttered that the corpse trial had crossed a line. Within a few months, Stephen was imprisoned by a mob, then found strangled in his cell. No one was surprised. And as for Formosus, ironically, after all that, he was reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full honors. Twice, actually. His legacy was partially restored, though historians still argue whether he deserved the honor. Some say he was a shrewd, reform-minded pope, caught in impossible politics. Others say he was a manipulator who played too many sides and finally lost. Either way, no other pope has been put on trial after death. Once was enough. You rub your arms, still chilled from the vibe. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a moment of medieval madness, it was a turning point, a clear signal that the papacy wasn't some divine moral beacon. It was a chessboard, and sometimes the pieces got weird? Quirky tidbit? After this event, the church briefly issued a new decree. Popes could not be judged once dead. They called it no trials for corpses, a rule you'd assume didn't need to be written until... well, it did. The basilica is quiet now. Echoes of that absurd court drama have faded into candle smoke and silence. You pass the empty throne where Formosus once slouched, bones wrapped in embroidered shame. It's just a chair now, a symbol without a voice. You wonder how many other papal secrets are buried here. Not just under marble floors, but inside the memories of frescoed walls and incense-soaked pews. You turn the corner and catch a glimpse of something new. A fresco showing a teenage boy in papal robes, tipping over a wine jug and laughing. That can't be real, can it? Oh, but it is. Next up, the frat party pope. And if you thought things were already absurd, brace yourself. He hasn't even graduated puberty yet. You're standing in a lavish hall where the walls are so gold they reflect your face like a funhouse mirror. Marble floors, velvet drapes, and tapestries thicker than winter cloaks line the room. But what catches your eye isn't the luxury, it's the noise. Loud laughter, the unmistakable sound of a goblet shattering, and someone, definitely someone, shouting Latin curses while playing dice. Welcome to the Lateran Palace, and welcome to the papacy of John the 12th. Probably the youngest, wildest, and most spectacularly unqualified pope in all of church history. He's not your standard old man in robes. No stooped back or soft-spoken Latin prayers. No, this pope's barely grown stubble. He's 16, possibly 15, maybe 18. Historians still argue whether his exact age was known, but it doesn't change the vibe. This kid is running the Catholic Church like it's a teen after-party his parents forgot to cancel. You inch toward the corner of the room, trying to stay out of sight. There's a party going on. Not a dignified, incense-heavy papal banquet. No, this feels more like a Roman version of spring break. Except the toga isn't optional, and the guy leading it all wears the papal tiara. John the 12th was born as Octavianus in 937, part of a powerful Roman noble family. His dad, Alberic II, more or less installed him as pope when he was still practically picking at acne. It wasn't a spiritual decision. It was political. Alberic wanted to control the Vatican even after he died, and what better way than to plop your teenage son into the most powerful throne in Christendom? The result? Chaos wrapped in silk, soaked in wine. You peek around a marble column, there he is, John the 12th himself, lounging in a chair carved from ivory, shirt open, crown askew, and one sandal kicked off. He's laughing at something whispered by a woman seated in his lap. The woman is definitely not a nun. Whispers in Rome say that under John's rule, the Lateran Palace was transformed into a brothel. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's what actual clerics of the time claimed, even conservative. Churchmen, usually tight-lipped, called it the House of Harlots. You hear the phrase murmured as a servant slips by you. Domus meretricium. The list of his alleged scandals is wild enough to be a college prank list. He was accused of ordaining a deacon in a stable, selling church offices like candy at a festival, and, to quote one contemporary chronicler, invoking demons while playing dice. That's right, even his gambling came with a supernatural flair. And yes, historians still debate which of these accusations are true and which were political smears. But the sheer number and intensity suggest that something unholy was definitely going down in the Lateran corridors. You find yourself wandering deeper into the palace, past the party rooms and toward a private chamber. The door is cracked open. Inside, a meeting is happening. Not of bishops, but of bishops' enemies, soldiers, nobles, mercenaries. You quickly realize John wasn't content with just parties. He dabbled in war, too. At one point, he invited Otto I, the German king, to come to Rome and help defend his position. Otto arrived, helped out, and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by John's own teenage hands. But then John got cold feet. Or bored. Or threatened. Either way, he started secretly writing letters to Otto's enemies, encouraging them to attack. Otto found out. The betrayal wasn't just rude, it was insanely risky. Otto marched back into Rome, convened a synod of bishops, and put John on trial. This time, unlike poor Formosus, the defendant was alive. John didn't show up, not once. He was too busy fleeing the city, possibly with a stolen church treasury in tow. The synod declared him deposed. The bishops listed his sins on official documents: simony, sacrilege, murder, perjury, incest, and yeah, let's just say the list was long and spicy. Some of it may have been exaggerated, sure, but some of it, likely true. The church replaced him with a new pope, Leo VIII. But here's the kicker. John came back, with mercenaries. He stormed into Rome like it was a video game quest, kicked out his replacement, mutilated some clergy who dared oppose him, and reinstalled himself on the papal throne like it was his gaming chair. Then, suddenly, quiet. He died. Alone. According to one medieval source, he died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Other reports say he was beaten to death by the woman's husband, who burst into the room like a wrathful plot twist. Either way, his papacy ended the way it had begun. Messy, scandalous, and more Roman comedy than religious epic. You walk through the ruins of his bedroom. The bed is gone, the walls repainted over centuries, but something still lingers. A feeling, like the air remembers. Or maybe it's just the smell of old wine soaked deep into the stone. Mainstream historical fact. John XII's reign is one of the most cited examples of papal corruption in the 10th century, a time already nicknamed the Iron Age of the Papacy for how brutal and chaotic it was. He was the epitome of everything reformers would later try to fix. And quirky tidbit? John once renamed months of the year after himself and his mistresses. Because if you're going to be pope, why not mess with the calendar too? The echoes of his laughter fade as you exit the palace. Outside, the sky is darker now, lit only by flickering torches and the quiet stars above. Rome sleeps restlessly beneath you. You sigh. Just when you think things can't get any more bizarre, you remember what comes next. A man who held the papacy 3 separate times, who literally sold the papal office like a second-hand tunic. Yes, up next, the Pope who quit and then came back. Twice. You step through the stone archway of yet another Roman chamber, half expecting more chaos, and surprise, it's there waiting for you. But this time, it's weirder. Less drunken teenager, more spiritual hot potato. Because now you've entered the domain of Pope Benedict IX, a man who treated the papacy not as a calling, not as a sacred trust, but as his own personal subscription service, with a cancel anytime policy. Get this, he was Pope 3 separate times, yes, 3. Like rebooting a glitchy app, Benedict IX just kept coming back. You blink at the timeline painted along the hallway. It's dizzying. First papacy, 1032. Second, 1045. Third, 1047. And in between those dates, betrayals, bribes, a papal resignation for cash. Honestly, you could turn this into a TV series and no one would believe it's real. Benedict IX was born Theophylactus of Tusculum, from a family that practically owned the papacy like it was a family business. The Tusculani clan had already provided a few popes, and when young Theo came of age, or close enough, his powerful uncles decided it was his turn. And by of age, we're not talking about 30s or even 20s. He was likely around 20, possibly younger. Historians still argue whether he was a legal adult or just legally obnoxious. You creep into the papal chapel, but instead of incense and prayers, you hear something else. Coins clinking, whispers about deals. There's no choir, just quiet scheming. Because Benedict IX wasn't just young, he was wild. Chronicles accuse him of everything from violence to orgies to literal satanic rituals. Though, of course, medieval enemies loved tossing "he dined with demons" into smear campaigns. Whether he really practiced black magic or just had bad friends with worse parties, we may never know. But what we do know? He wasn't interested in spiritual leadership. Not even a little. At one point during his rule, things got so bad that the people of Rome rose up, not just once, but multiple times, to throw him out. Imagine being so disliked that mobs would rather have no pope at all than keep you in office. That's where we're at. After his first expulsion, he fled the city. But then, plot twist, he came back, with more muscle, reclaimed the papacy. Business as usual. Then, a few years later, in 1045, he decided he didn't really want to be pope anymore. He wanted to get married. No, really. Benedict fell in love. though with whom the records don't say. Some claim it was a cousin, because medieval Rome. Others say it was a noblewoman who turned him down anyway. Whatever the truth, he wanted out of the job. But instead of just walking away quietly, he did what any enterprising medieval man might do. He sold the papacy. Yes, he approached his godfather, Giovanni Gratian, who was a respected archpriest, and offered him a divine deal, the papal throne, for a modest sum. A few bags of silver and boom, Gratian becomes Pope Gregory VI. This bizarre transaction was one of the clearest cases of simony in papal history, the selling of sacred offices. It shocked even the jaded Roman elite. Still, Gratian accepted, maybe with noble intentions. Maybe he thought he could stabilize the church. Spoiler, he could not. But the drama wasn't done. Not long after, Benedict had seller's remorse. His engagement fell through, or maybe he just missed the lifestyle, the wealth, the power. So he returned to Rome and claimed the papacy again. For the third time. Let that sink in. You're a pope. You quit. You sell your title. Then you waltz back in like it's your old dorm room and you forgot your sandals. At one point, there were 3 rival popes all claiming the throne: Benedict IX, Gregory VI, his buyer, and a third guy, Sylvester III, who had been tossed in during one of Benedict's many vacations. This led to complete chaos. So much chaos, in fact, that the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Henry III, decided to intervene. He marched to Rome in 1046 and convened a council in Sutri, outside the city. The result? All 3 popes were deposed. Benedict was excommunicated, Gregory resigned in disgrace, and Sylvester, well, he just disappeared into history like a cameo nobody wanted. Mainstream fact? Benedict IX remains one of the most notorious popes in church history, not just for his behavior, but for the sheer absurdity of how many times he sat on the throne. 3 papacies, 3 exits, and absolutely zero sense of shame. Quirky tidbit? After his final ousting, Benedict tried to sell the papacy again, this time without owning it anymore. That's like selling a car you already returned. Illegal, baffling, and very on brand. You walk past a carved plaque that once bore his name, now chipped and faded. Time has tried to erase him, but not completely. Because Benedict IX taught the world a crucial lesson, that even the holiest titles mean nothing in the hands of someone who just wants a better real estate portfolio. Historians still argue whether he was simply corrupt or mentally unstable. Maybe both, maybe neither. But no one disputes this. He turned the papacy into a joke so outrageous it forced the church to begin taking reform seriously. Eventually, you emerge from the chamber into the cool Roman evening. A wind stirs the papal banners, casting long shadows across the square. But the shadows feel different now, less sacred, more slippery. And you're just getting started. Because next comes a man who stayed in office but maybe really shouldn't have. A pope with a voice like thunder and a temper to match. Get ready to flinch. You're walking straight into the reign of the screaming pope. You step through a towering doorway into the Vatican's inner sanctum, half expecting peace, solemnity, maybe a quiet little prayer echoing off the walls. Instead, you nearly jump out of your skin. Liars! Heretics! Fools! A voice bellows down the corridor like a thunderclap wrapped in Latin fury. You're in the era of Pope Urban VI, a man who shouted more than he blessed, alienated nearly everyone around him, and single-handedly helped ignite one of the biggest messes in church history, the Western Schism. And as you tiptoe further in, you get the feeling, this man was not made for diplomacy. Urban VI was elected pope in 1378. His real name? Bartolomeo Prignano. A stern, ascetic man, and this is important, not a cardinal at the time of his election. That already raised a few eyebrows, but more importantly, he wasn't a Roman. That mattered. See, just before him, the papacy had been in exile in Avignon, France for nearly 70 years. Popes had gotten cozy with French kings, and Italians were not loving it. So, when Pope Gregory XI died and the conclave gathered in Rome, a mob formed outside the walls, chanting, screaming, even threatening violence, demanding a Roman pope. The cardinals, terrified of being murdered in their pajamas, elected someone Italian enough, Prignano, technically Neapolitan. Close enough. At first they thought they'd made a decent pick. He was a reformer, seemed serious. A bit stiff, maybe, but hey, this was the papacy, not a birthday party. Then he started yelling. A lot. Urban VI, once given supreme authority, revealed a volcanic temper that could fry a choir boy at 50 paces. He'd rant for hours, criticize bishops to their faces in front of servants, mock his cardinals in meetings. Once he accused half his inner circle of conspiring against him and had several of them imprisoned, tortured, and executed. That's not an exaggeration, he really did that. And the cardinals? They were not about to sit quietly and wait for lightning to strike. So they fled Rome and declared that Urban's election had been invalid, citing that it was made under mob pressure. They said, "Oops, our bad. Let's fix this," and promptly elected a second pope, Clement VII. Clement set up shop back in Avignon, and now suddenly, bam, we've got two popes. Two. Both claiming to be the real deal. Cue the Western Schism, a decades-long nightmare that divided Europe. Kingdoms had to pick sides. Was the true pope in Rome or in France? If you were French, you probably went with Clement. If you were loyal to the Holy Roman Empire or English, you stuck with Urban. And if you were a regular person just trying to not go to hell, you had no idea whom to believe. This wasn't just an awkward holiday dinner scenario. It was geopolitical chaos disguised as religious devotion. And at the fiery center of it all was Urban VI. Raging, unforgiving, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. You sit on a bench in the papal courtyard, the sun heavy on your shoulders, and listen. You can still hear the echoes of his voice, scolding someone for smiling too much during Lent, berating another for owning silk gloves. He believed reform meant pain, and he dished it out with holy enthusiasm. Quirky detail? Urban once planned to excommunicate all cardinals who spent more than 4 hours a day on personal grooming. Let's just say the men of the cloth weren't thrilled about cutting their hair time. And mainstream fact? The Western Schism lasted nearly 40 years. It would eventually escalate to 3 popes all claiming legitimacy. Urban never lived to see that, but he planted the seed, and he watered it with pure, unfiltered spite. Historians still argue whether Urban was a necessary shock to a corrupt system, or just an angry man in the wrong job. Some say he was a proto-reformer trying to clean up decadence. Others say he was a spiritual tyrant whose pride wrecked unity for decades. But as you stand brushing dust from your robes, one thing is clear. He was loud. And the church? The church never forgot the noise. You walk onward now, past old stone steps where messengers once ran back and forth with contradictory orders from rival popes. The tension has cooled, but the footprints remain, and you, dear listener, are just beginning to grasp how far this rabbit hole goes. Because if Pope Urban VI yelled his enemies into the grave, the next man simply eliminated them. Quietly, poisonously, and with a smirk. You're about to meet the anti-pope who stole the Vatican's treasures and murdered his way to the top. You find yourself descending into a room that smells of damp stone, old wax, and betrayal. The flickering torches here burn lower. The air is heavier. There are no choirs, no echoes of prayer, just the distant shuffle of boots and the occasional clink of coins being counted behind a locked door. Welcome to the shadow papacy of Boniface VII, or, as some historians prefer to call him, the anti-pope who just would not go away. Others more dramatically called him the monster of Rome. Catchy. And, to be honest, not entirely unfair. Boniface VII didn't just claim to be pope, he stole the title twice. He robbed the church's treasury, murdered at least one pope, possibly 2, and managed to turn the Vatican into his own little mafia den. If previous popes were wild, scandalous, or reckless, Boniface was sinister. You brush past a curtain into a dimly lit corridor where heavy iron doors line the walls. They were used to store holy relics once, but under Boniface they hid something else entirely. Stolen gold, forged documents, and occasionally corpses. Let's rewind. It's the late 1970s. Pope Benedict VI, the legitimate pope at the time, finds himself on the wrong side of Rome's constantly shifting political tides. A powerful noble faction, led by Crescentius, a member of one of Rome's elite families, wants a new puppet in the chair. Someone loyal, someone ruthless. Enter Boniface VII. He wasn't even a bishop, just a cardinal deacon. But that didn't stop him. With the help of Crescentius and a few hired musclemen, he launched a coup, imprisoned Pope Benedict VI, and, deep breath, eventually had him strangled in his cell. That was Boniface's first attempt at being pope. Rome was not thrilled. The public backlash was immediate. The Holy Roman Emperor sent troops. Boniface panicked, and what did he do? He looted the Vatican's treasury, yes, literally emptied the coffers, and fled to Constantinople with enough gold to buy a small kingdom. That might have been the end of the story. Anti-pope, fugitive, vanished. But no, this guy came back. In 984, after the legitimate Pope John XIV died under murky circumstances, some say he starved, others whisper he was poisoned, Boniface saw his chance. He marched back into Rome, likely with some gold-fueled bribes, and reclaimed the papacy. This time officially. No elections, no approval. Just mine now energy. And Rome, exhausted and leaderless, let him in. For a year, Boniface VII ruled with iron fists wrapped in velvet gloves. He rewarded loyalists, punished dissenters, and tightened his grip with the cold efficiency of a dictator. Meanwhile, rumors swirled of secret executions, quiet assassinations, and coin purses exchanged in candlelit corridors. You pause at one such corridor now, your breath misting as the chill deepens. And here's the kicker. While other popes masked corruption in incense and piety, Boniface barely pretended. He knew what he was and leaned into it. He ruled not like a shepherd, but like a gangster in a cassock. Quirky tidbit? Boniface allegedly paid men to whisper his holiness in marketplaces, to create the illusion that his papacy was loved by the people. The original PR campaign sponsored by fear and florins. But his second reign, like the first, didn't last. Just over a year after returning, he was found dead. Probably poisoned. It's hard to say whether it was his own guards, Roman nobles, or divine intervention. The cause is still debated, but the effect was immediate. Rome turned on him with legendary spite. They dragged his corpse through the streets. Yes, again, with the dragging. They stripped his body naked, mocked it, and dumped it at the feet of the Lateran Basilica, unburied, unwanted, unmourned. Eventually, a group of clergy retrieved the body, gave it a quiet burial, and tried to scrub his name from the record. But Boniface VII left a stain that couldn't be cleaned. He wasn't forgotten. Mainstream fact? Boniface VII is still regarded as one of the most corrupt and violent claimants to the papacy in history. Even the Catholic Church never recognized him as a legitimate pope. He remains an anti-pope, a usurper whose reign was built on blood and gold. Historians still argue whether Boniface's second term was truly papal or merely tolerated. Was it rule by consent or rule by exhaustion? Some say Rome accepted him out of fear. Others argue it was just political convenience. You slip into a chamber once used for treasury records. Empty shelves now. Just dust and the faint echo of coins that bought a throne. You lean on a cold marble column and let your mind catch up. A pope who murdered, looted, fled, and returned. Twice. A pope who turned the Holy See into a criminal enterprise. And still, the papal story is far from over. Because next up, a man whose name you might recognize. A man with a family so famous, so poisonous, so flamboyant, they inspired centuries of drama and conspiracy. Yes, you're about to step into the perfumed and poison-laced world of the Borgias. And the Pope at the center of it all? Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI. Get ready. The food is delicious. The wine never stops. And someone at dinner is definitely plotting to kill you. You can smell the feast before you even reach the dining hall. Roasted game birds, spiced fruits, platters of truffles and honey-glazed chestnuts, all laid out under flickering chandeliers. Perfume hangs thick in the air, covering something sharper. Something like fear and poison. Possibly both. Welcome to the table of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. Cardinal, father, political tactician, Pope, and walking scandal. You slip into the shadow of a velvet curtain just as a servant sweeps by with a gilded tray. His eyes flick left, then right. Nobody moves casually in this palace. Everyone calculates. Everyone listens. Because in the Borgia household, secrets are currency, and if you misplace yours, you may not live to regret it. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope in 1492. Yep, same year Columbus sailed west and discovered a continent full of future tragedy. While ships crossed oceans, Rome had its own explorer, one not of seas but of sin and strategy. Borgia's papacy? It's the textbook definition of excess. He threw parties that made royal banquets look like awkward family dinners. He elevated his children, yes, children, into powerful positions. His son Cesare became a cardinal and later a military commander, while his daughter Lucrezia was married off like a political chess piece again and again. You wander deeper into the Vatican apartments now draped in Borgia crimson. Silk tapestries depict saints, mostly looking away awkwardly, as if even they can't believe what's happening under their stitched gaze. Alexander VI wasn't the first pope with a mistress, but he was the first to flaunt it so shamelessly. Vanozza de Catane bore him 4 kids. Then there was Giulia Farnese, nicknamed Giulia la Bella, a noblewoman who may have doubled as a political informant in his bedroom. Church records? Silent? Gossip? Deafening. In his late 60s and early 70s, Alexander threw feasts that echoed through the Roman night. Candles flickering over marble, dancers twirling in barely their fabric, and noblemen gambling fortunes with fingers greasy from roast pig. And one night, the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts. Whether legend or exaggerated truth, the tale goes like this. In the papal palace, a dinner party was hosted, attended by cardinals, nobles, and dozens of courtesans. After dessert, a contest began. Servants crawled across the floor collecting chestnuts, while the women performed acrobatics of a most scandalous sort. The night ended with prizes for those who participated with the most, shall we say, enthusiasm. Historians still argue whether this event truly happened as described, or whether it was invented by enemies to discredit him. But even if it was exaggerated, it fit the vibe a little too well. And what of Lucrezia, his daughter? Was she just a pawn, a victim, a co-conspirator? She was married off at 13, later at 17, and again at 20. Each time to men with land or titles her father wanted. Rumors swirled of incest, poison rings, and secret pregnancies. But again, proof is foggy. What is clear? She was politically invaluable. She hosted Vatican events, sat beside ambassadors, and wielded influence that most men would kill for, and many did. Alexander VI used his papacy to enrich his family. Lands, castles, military campaigns. Nepotism wasn't a flaw, it was a blueprint. He created cardinals from among his allies. He sold offices, indulgences, and titles like raffle tickets. If you had enough gold, you could walk out of Rome a bishop, regardless of your lack of qualifications. Mainstream fact? Rodrigo Borgia is widely considered one of the most controversial and politically corrupt popes in history. Even contemporary Catholic writers couldn't deny his brazen pursuit of wealth and power. But he was also competent. He reorganized the Vatican's finances, commissioned art, strengthened political control over the Papal States. You know, between the affairs and assassinations, and quirky tidbit? During Alexander's reign, Vatican officials began using perfumed ink for personal correspondence. A literal scented paper trail. Imagine excommunicating someone with lavender-scented stationery. You pass by the window now, overlooking the Vatican gardens. They say he planted cypress trees for every new lover. If so, the grove would be thick enough to get lost in. His end came appropriately after dinner. In 1503, Alexander and Cesare fell ill. Rumors swirled it was poison. Some claimed it was meant for another cardinal. Others whispered the Borgias poisoned themselves by accident. A cosmic punchline. Alexander died. Cesare survived, barely. He was buried quietly without fanfare, later exhumed, reburied, forgotten, then remembered, then demonized, then reanalyzed by historians trying to separate man from myth. Today, some argue he was just a product of his time, a Renaissance figure who wielded power as it was meant to be wielded, with teeth. Others? They still call him a devil in robes. You leave the feast now, full, not with food, but with a bitter aftertaste. The Borgias weren't the end of papal corruption, just the most colorful chapter. Because next, you'll meet a man who may have loved gold even more, but preferred to spend it on statues, operas, and a circus-level party that nearly bankrupted the church. You're heading into the Renaissance's grandest papal party. Brace yourself for fountains of wine and elephants. Yes, elephants. You're standing at the edge of a courtyard so opulent, so absurdly grand, that your brain momentarily forgets you're in a holy city. For a second, it feels more like Vegas married Florence and gave birth to a Vatican baby covered in gold leaf. A man rides by on a white elephant, no joke. Behind him, a procession of costumed dancers, jesters tossing coins into the crowd, and a brass band so loud it rattles your teeth. You've just stumbled into the party palace of Pope Leo XI, a Medici pope, a Renaissance patron, and the walking definition of champagne taste on someone else's spiritual budget. Born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, Leo XI was elected pope in 1513. He was the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Florence's most powerful banking and art-loving ruler. Giovanni had been raised not to lead armies or run businesses, but to be a pope. It was planned before he could even ride a pony. And when he finally sat on the papal throne, he brought with him the full Medici playbook. Wealth, culture, and an absolute disregard for financial restraint. You stroll through his private Vatican apartments now, each room a masterclass in Renaissance indulgence. Painted ceilings by Raphael, imported marble floors, silk curtains thick enough to muffle the sins of a small kingdom. Leo loved beauty. He genuinely adored art, theater, music, architecture, all the trappings of human creativity. His court was overflowing with painters, sculptors, composers, and poets. Under his reign, Rome became a cultural supernova. But beauty? It doesn't come cheap. To fund his constant festivals, art commissions, and personal luxuries, Leo X burned through church funds like a teenager with their parents' credit card. Banquets for hundreds, private circuses, fireworks shows visible across the Tiber, and yes, an actual trained elephant named Hano, gifted by the King of Portugal. Hano became something of a Vatican mascot. He had his own stable near St. Peter's, was trained to kneel on command. And when he died of constipation, true story, Leo wept and buried him with honors, complete with a poem by the papal court poet. You pass the old garden where Hano once strolled. A faded stone elephant marks the spot. Leo's spending wasn't just for show. He used lavish gifts and cultural prestige as political tools, charming nobles, impressing foreign dignitaries and reinforcing the church's image as a beacon of divine glory on earth. But beneath the velvet and violins, something darker simmered. To keep the papal treasury afloat, Leo X authorized widespread sale of indulgences. Basically, spiritual get-out-of-purgatory free cards you could buy for cash. These weren't new, but under Leo, the practice exploded. Professional salesmen toured Europe, preaching fiery sermons about damnation and dangling salvation like a Black Friday deal. Enter Martin Luther, a monk in Germany outraged by what he saw as spiritual extortion, nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. It was a theological mic drop, and the start of the Protestant Reformation. Now, did Leo panic? Not exactly. At first he laughed it off. Called Luther a drunken German who would feel differently once he sobered up. But the sobering never came. Instead, the Reformation spread like wildfire. Leo tried to suppress it, declared Luther a heretic, issued bulls of excommunication, but the damage was done. The splintering of Western Christianity had begun. And here's the irony. While the church crumbled abroad, Leo kept throwing parties in Rome. Mainstream historical fact? Leo X is remembered as a patron of the arts, but also as the Pope who failed to prevent the Reformation. His luxurious lifestyle and aggressive fundraising practices created the perfect storm of resentment and rebellion across Europe. Quirky tidbit? Leo once received a mechanical organ powered by water as a gift. He was so amused he made everyone in the Curia listen to it before dinner, calling it proof that man could imitate angels. Most cardinals just wanted to eat. Historians still argue whether Leo was naive or calculated. Did he truly underestimate Luther's challenge, or was he just too distracted by elephant parades and wine fountains to care? You wander past the Hall of Constantine, where Leo once danced beneath golden ceilings while the outside world questioned the church's authority. There's a strange echo here. Music that once played, laughter that once rang through these halls. But it's gone now. Faded. Like perfume on old parchment. Leo died in 1521, likely of pneumonia. Some whispered he was poisoned. Others that his weight and stress caught up to him. Either way, his death was sudden. And the Vatican treasury? Absolutely empty. Not a lira left. The popes that followed would scramble to recover, rebuild, retrench. But the cultural powder keg had already exploded. And as you exit Leo's gilded world, blinking into the less decorated halls beyond, you feel the weight of something shifting. Beauty without restraint. Faith without reform. It couldn't last. So the next pope? He didn't throw parties. He threw punches, armor, swords, siege towers. You're about to meet Pope Julius II, the warrior pope. And no, that's not a metaphor. He literally led armies into battle. The air is different now. Gone is the sweet haze of incense and wine. The laughter of courtesans has faded. You can feel it in the stones underfoot. Harder, colder, roughened by the boots of soldiers rather than the slippers of bishops. You're no longer in the Vatican's palace of pleasure. You've crossed into a war room. This is the reign of Pope Julius II, a pope who traded velvet for armor, scripture for siege plans, and didn't just bless armies. He led them. You step into a private chamber that smells of oil, iron, and sweat. Maps are unrolled across the table. Swords hang on the wall beside tapestries of saints. And in the corner, a dented helmet painted with a tiny papal coat of arms. This is no Renaissance prince posing in costume. This is the warrior pope, and he's not here to pray. Julius II, born Giuliano della Rovere, was elected pope in 1503. But before he got the white robes, he'd spent decades clawing his way through church politics like a mountain lion in a cassock. He was the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, and like many cardinals of the time, he rose through sheer grit, ambition, and well-placed family ties. But what made Julius truly different was this. He didn't want to hide behind the papacy. He wanted to wield it, like a sword. Almost immediately after his coronation, he began traveling, not to give blessings, but to rally troops. Italy at the time was a fractured mess of city-states, foreign invaders, and shifting alliances. Julius didn't like that. He wanted a unified papal states, free from outside interference. And if that meant war, well then, Deus Vult. You watch as he strides into the courtyard in full battle gear. White beard tucked under a steel helmet, the papal banner fluttering behind him. He doesn't ride in a carriage, he mounts a horse. Doesn't wait behind the walls, he rides to the front. In 1506, he personally led a campaign to reclaim Bologna from a rebellious noble family. When his generals hesitated, he snapped, "Are you men or mice? Get your boots on." He marched in himself, stormed the gates, and retook the city. And that was just the start. Over the next few years, he joined coalitions against Venice, fought back French incursions, and juggled alliances like flaming torches. One day he'd curse France as the enemy of Christendom. The next he'd shake hands with them, then double-cross them the next month. It was papal politics as powerlifting. Mainstream fact? Julius II used the Swiss Guard, founded in 1506 by his own order, as his personal bodyguard. They weren't just ceremonial, they were armed and deadly. He wanted loyalty, muscle, and style. And he got all three. You stroll past a fresco depicting Julius holding a sword aloft. It's not symbolic, he really did carry one. Contemporary accounts describe him riding into cities, sword unsheathed, while citizens cheered or cowered. But don't mistake him for a mere brute. Julius loved art, and he knew its power. While launching wars, he also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That's right. The same hand that clenched a sword also hired one of the greatest artists in history. You walk beneath that same ceiling now. The light shifts across the frescoes. Adam reaching out to God, prophets lost in thought, angels suspended mid-breath. And while Michelangelo was up there, painting on scaffolds, Julius would pace below. Impatient, demanding, sometimes screaming. The two men despised each other. Quirky tidbit? During a particularly heated argument, Michelangelo stormed off and refused to continue. Julius sent soldiers to drag him back. The Pope reportedly muttered, "If he weren't so good, I'd have had him excommunicated by now." That tension, it birthed a masterpiece. But even masterpieces couldn't keep Julius from war. In his later years, he launched the Holy League, a military coalition to push France out of Italy. For a time, it worked, but the cost? Enormous. Towns destroyed, lives lost, enemies made, the Vatican treasury bled. Historians still argue whether Julius was a defender of Italy or just another ego in armor. Some call him a patriot, fighting for the independence of the Papal States. Others see a violent opportunist who preferred the battlefield to the Bible. One thing's for sure. He made the papacy feared. Not just respected, feared. And that legacy would echo long after his death in 1513. You step into his private chapel. No gold, no perfumes, just stone and candlelight. His tomb lies beneath the floor, modest considering the man. But maybe that's fitting. Julius wasn't about show, he was about impact. You sit quietly, the air is heavy with memory. Popes before him had ruled from bedchambers and banquet halls. Julius ruled from horseback. He made the Vatican a player on the European stage, not just spiritually but politically and militarily. But as always, when a strong hand loosens its grip, chaos follows. And what comes next? Scandal, affairs, a papacy run not. Fairs. A papacy. Just by one man, but by his mistresses, his son, and his secret deals. You've survived a warrior. Now step carefully. You're entering the age of Pope Sergius III, and the dawn of what historians call the pornocracy. You push open a creaky wooden door and step into a room lit by candlelight so soft it seems embarrassed to shine. The walls are covered not with frescoes or marble, but with faded, peeling tapestries and shadowy portraits, eyes half-lidded like they've seen too much and are trying to forget. This isn't the clean, polished Renaissance anymore. You've arrived in the 10th century, and you've just met Pope Sergius III, a man whose papacy kicked off one of the most scandalous, gossip-drenched back-alley eras in all of church history. The pornocracy. Yes, that is a real term. No, you're not dreaming. You walk slowly past a chipped marble bust of Sergius. His face is stern, bearded, powerful, but it's hard to look at the sculpture without thinking about everything that happened behind the scenes. Because Sergius wasn't just a morally questionable pope. He was the figurehead of a dynasty of lust, power, and manipulation, all orchestrated by women who didn't sit on the throne but moved it. Let's rewind. Sergius III was elected pope in 904, but not before a brutal power struggle that involved multiple claimants to the papacy, all backed by noble families who treated the Holy See like a poker game. Before Sergius, Pope John IX had tried to bring some order. After him, Pope Benedict IV gave it a shot. Then Leo V, who was imprisoned by his own successor. That guy, Anti-Pope Christopher, then got deposed, possibly murdered, by Sergius III. Are you dizzy yet? Because the church certainly was. And in the middle of it all stood Sergius, charismatic, ruthless, and ambitious. He took the papal throne by force and made no effort to hide the fact that he was here to do his bidding. But here's where it gets particularly spicy. Sergius had a mistress. Her name was Marozia. She was a Roman noblewoman, the daughter of Theodora, a powerful figure in her own right. Together, this mother-daughter duo became the invisible hands behind the papal crown for decades. They didn't wear tiaras, they didn't hold councils, but they owned the Vatican. And Marozia, she was just getting started. She and Sergius had a son together. Historians are fairly certain of this, though a few still raise skeptical eyebrows. What's not debated is this. That son grew up to become Pope John XI. Yes, Sergius's son, born from an extramarital affair with a Roman noblewoman, eventually wore the papal crown. You glance out the stained glass window, the colors muted under the dust. Somewhere in that city below, a woman once whispered a command, and a pope was made. This was the pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, as coined by later chroniclers. Though it's worth noting that many modern historians consider the term deeply sexist and oversimplified. Still, it reflects a certain truth. During this era, the papacy was dominated by a web of powerful Roman women who used their beauty, wealth, and strategic marriages to control who wore the tiara. And Marozia? She was queen of the game. After Sergius died, she married again, this time to a noble who helped her control the next few popes. When one of them got too independent, he mysteriously vanished. The pattern repeated, and when she had enough, she installed her own son as pope. Mainstream historical fact? Pope John XI, almost certainly Marozia's son, reigned from 931 to 935. He was likely controlled by her from behind the scenes. Quirky tidbit? Marozia once held a papal council in her villa. Imagine that. Bishops gathered, hats in hand, waiting for her to approve the agenda. Technically illegal, completely effective. You press a hand to a cold column carved with faint crosses. It's hard to know how to feel. The medieval church often painted Marozia and her mother as immoral temptresses, but were they really worse than the bloodthirsty noblemen who poisoned and stabbed their way to power? Historians still argue whether Marozia was a villain or a victim of her time. Some paint her as a scheming seductress. Others call her a political genius navigating a male-dominated world with the only tools she had. One thing's for sure. Sergius III was the start. The first pope in over a century to use outright violence to seize power. and the first to leave a child who'd one day wear his ring. After his death, the papacy entered a bizarre dynasty. For decades, it was a revolving door of popes linked to Marozia's family. By blood, by marriage, by bribes. You sit on a stone bench, the light from a single candle flickering in the gloom. In the corner of the room, an old tapestry depicts the Virgin Mary watching over Rome. But the real Rome, outside that window, it was a chessboard. And Marozia was always 3 moves ahead. You rise and step into the hallway, where the air feels just a little cleaner. The corridors widen. The scandals don't stop, but they change shape. Because next you'll meet a woman whose influence isn't whispered through back doors. It's shouted across a city on fire. You're about to watch Rome burn, watch England break away, and witness a pope who tried to hold it all together. And failed spectacularly. Up next, Pope Clement VII and the era of everything going wrong. The walls are cracked. Literally. And metaphorically. You stand in a Vatican chamber that still bears scorch marks from a time when even the stones could no longer hold back the chaos. The windows are boarded. The tapestries hang limp and dark. Outside, the faint echo of a riot drifts through the corridors like the memory of thunder. This is the world of Pope Clement VII, and to be very clear, this man could not catch a break. Born Giulio de' Medici, Clement VII had pedigree. A Medici by blood, nephew to the warrior Pope Julius II, remember him? And cousin to Pope Leo X, the one with the elephant. He had money, influence, connections, all the things that, in theory, should have made him a power pope. Instead, he became the papal version of Murphy's Law. If it could go wrong under Clement VII, it did. You walk into the apostolic palace and feel the tension still embedded in the marble. You can practically hear someone sighing in Latin behind every door. Clement was elected in 1523, right after the death of Adrian VI, a Dutch reformer pope who tried, and failed, to clean up Rome after the Borgia luxury era. The cardinals, exhausted by austerity, turned back to a Medici. Surely a man with charm and culture could bring order? Right? Cue the unraveling. First crisis, the Reformation. Martin Luther was in full swing now. Churches in Germany were breaking from Rome. Protestants were multiplying like medieval rabbits. Clement, wanting to avoid war with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, tried to play it safe. No bold declarations, no aggressive reforms. Result? Both sides hated him. Then came the big one. England. King Henry VIII wanted a divorce. Or to be technical, an annulment. He claimed his marriage to Catherine of Aragon wasn't valid because she had been his brother's widow. He needed the Pope to approve it so he could marry Anne Boleyn and, more importantly, have a male heir. Now, under normal circumstances, the Pope might have considered it. But here's the twist. Catherine of Aragon's nephew was... Wait for it. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. And Clement, at the time, he was literally Charles's prisoner. You stare out of a shattered stained glass window. Yes, this really happened. Because in 1527, while Clement was caught in the middle of endless political tension between France and the Empire, Rome was attacked. But not by outsiders, not by heretics. By the emperor's own troops, the sack of Rome. Tens of thousands of mercenaries, many unpaid and half mad with hunger, stormed the city. The Pope's Swiss Guard made a desperate stand, holding the steps of St. Peter's Basilica while Clement fled through secret tunnels to Castel Sant'Angelo. Blood flooded the streets, churches looted, nuns violated, priests executed, paintings slashed, bones shattered, gold stolen. And the Pope? He spent 7 months trapped in his fortress, watching the city burn from behind stone walls, eating stale biscuits and weeping into the night. Mainstream historical fact? The sack of Rome in 1527 is widely considered one of the darkest moments in papal history. and Clement VII's greatest failure. He had tried to play both sides in Europe's endless power struggles. Instead, he got crushed between them. And back to England? Clement refused Henry's annulment, either because of conscience or more likely because he didn't dare anger Charles V again. So Henry VIII said, "Fine," broke from the Catholic Church, and declared himself head of the Church of England. That's right. The Anglican Church started on Clement VII's watch. And the Protestant movement? Gaining steam like an out-of-control medieval train. All while the Vatican was physically smoldering. You pass a wooden crucifix cracked along the arms. One leg of the base is charred. It probably survived the sack. So did Clement, but barely. Quirky tidbit? During his imprisonment, Clement grew a full shaggy beard out of mourning and stress. It was so wild and unkempt, people joked he looked more like a desert hermit than a pope. He never shaved it again. When he was finally freed, he returned to a Vatican that was hollowed out, spiritually and literally. He spent the rest of his papacy trying to repair the damage, rebuilding churches, rehiring artists, smoothing over diplomatic disasters. But the cracks remained. Historians still argue whether Clement was weak, unlucky, or simply outmaneuvered. Was he too cautious? Too indecisive? Or was he the only adult in a room full of emperors and kings who treated the church like a chessboard? Either way, his reign ended in 1534. When he died, it was said that he'd never fully recovered from the trauma of the sack. And who could blame him? You walk through what's left of his private chapel. The walls have been restored, the paintings redone. But in the corners, if you look closely, there are still scorch marks. Little black ghosts of a fire that almost destroyed it all. And if you listen carefully, under the wind, beneath the soft creak of timber beams, you might still hear the distant roar of soldiers and the quiet breath of a pope in hiding. You leave the room quietly. You've just survived war, exile, and religious revolution. Now, you enter the age of iron doctrine and iron fists. Coming up, the Pope who feared no one, trusted no one, and crushed dissent under a velvet-gloved fist. He brought ghettos, burnings, and brutal censorship. His name? Pope Paul IV. And he made the Inquisition feel personal. The air grows still. Not quiet. Still. Like the pause before thunder, or the moment you realize someone's been watching you for far too long. You walk into a chamber stripped of beauty. No paintings, no sculpture. The walls are bare plaster stained with time. A single wooden cross hangs crooked above the doorway. You swear it twitches slightly as if reacting to the memory of fear. You've arrived in the reign of Pope Paul IV, and for the first time in this twisted journey, you feel the weight of history not as absurdity, but as oppression. You're no longer in the age of popes who feast or flirt or throw gold around like rose petals. You've entered the era of punishment. Paul IV didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be obeyed. Born Gian Pietro Carafa in 1476, he was a career inquisitor. A man molded not in silk but in ash and smoke. He believed, truly believed, that the church's survival depended on purity, and that purity was only possible through control. So when he became pope in 1555, already nearly 80 years old, he wasted no time unleashing his vision. And it was terrifying. You pass under a stone arch. A pair of iron gates creak open ahead. Behind them, what once was Rome's Jewish quarter. Because yes, Paul IV created the Roman ghetto. In 1555, he issued a papal bull called Cum Nimis Absurdum. The name translates awkwardly, but the meaning is clear. Jews were to be confined, marked, and restricted. They could not own property. They could not interact freely with Christians. They were forced to wear yellow badges. Yes, hundreds of years before 20th century fascism. The Vatican had its own code of visual segregation. The ghetto was surrounded by walls, locked at night, guarded. Mainstream historical fact. Paul IV's bull formally established the Jewish ghetto system in Rome, setting a precedent that would last for centuries. You walk its border now. The walls are gone, but the streets still remember. But Paul's obsession with purity didn't stop there. He supercharged the Roman Inquisition, a movement previously more about controlling clergy misconduct. Under Paul, it became a weapon. Books were banned, entire libraries burned. Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel? He ordered loincloths painted over the nudes. Literally, under Paul, angels wore modesty shorts. He created the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books. Think of it as a medieval version of being shadow banned, but with fire involved. If your writing ended up on this list, it could be seized, censored, and publicly destroyed. And if you kept a copy, the Inquisition would like a word. Quirky tidbit? Erasmus, one of the most influential Catholic scholars of the Renaissance, ended up on that banned list. Why? For being too reasonable. Yes, really, you wander into a dark hall where whispers seem to cling to the walls. You feel watched. Not by eyes, but by a presence. Paul had spies everywhere. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Clergy were dragged into trials based on the thinnest accusations. He even turned on his own allies. At one point, Paul ordered the arrest of members of the powerful Farnese family, relatives of a former pope, accusing them of moral laxity and ambition. Which, in fairness, wasn't wrong, but also meat kettle. Rome under Paul was a city of fear. The people grew restless, angry, but they kept their heads down. You would too in their shoes. Historians still argue whether Paul IV believed in the righteousness of his actions or whether he simply used faith as a cudgel. Some say he was sincere, a zealot with a heart full of fire. Others paint him as a bitter, aging man, projecting his inner rot onto the world. Either way, he left a mark. When he died in 1559, the people of Rome didn't mourn. They rioted. They stormed the Inquisition's palace, burned his statue in public, smashed his coat of arms off the walls. That doesn't happen often for popes. You step into his private prayer room, there are no windows, just a single candle. You sit in the silence, and it's suffocating. The kind of silence that demands penance, even if you're not sure what you've done wrong. This was the legacy Paul IV left. A church frightened of ideas, defensive against the world, and wrapped so tightly in chains of its own making that it would take generations to breathe again. But not all of it lasted. The ghetto would eventually be torn down, the index abolished. The frescoes of the Sistine Chapel would be restored. But the echo of Paul's rule lives on, in the way institutions sometimes confuse holiness with control, and faith with fear. And now, you rise. Because next is a different kind of struggle. Not one of oppression, but of stubbornness, of denial, of a pope who stood firm as the modern world rushed in like a rising tide, waving science, democracy, and nationalism. You're about to meet the last pope who ruled like a king, the man who lost an empire and still declared himself infallible. Pius IX is waiting, and he brought a whole doctrine to back it up. You blink into warm daylight now, finally stepping out of the long shadow cast by iron-fisted inquisitors. But the light doesn't bring relief. Instead, it reveals something stranger. You're standing at the edge of a balcony in the 19th century. Rome is still Rome, but something feels off. A little more modern, a little more crowded, but still ruled by a man in white robes who insists he's both your spiritual father and your earthly monarch. This is the reign of Pope Pius IX, or Pio Nono, as his supporters lovingly called him. But don't let the nickname fool you. Behind that soft-sounding title is a pope who began with idealism and ended with absolutism. A pope who opened his arms to progress, then slammed the doors shut harder than any Borgia ever could. You take a seat on a stone bench, watching as pigeons flutter across St. Peter's Square. But something's different. There are rifles in the distance. Because Pope Pius IX was the last pope to rule as a king. an actual temporal monarch over the Papal States, a swath of central Italy controlled by the Vatican since the 8th century. And during his reign, he lost it all. He became Pope in 1846, and in the beginning, people cheered. He was young, well, Pope young, had gentle eyes and seemed open to liberal ideas. He pardoned political prisoners, promised constitutional reforms, allowed limited press freedoms. It was like someone opened a window in a very stuffy room. For a brief moment, he was a liberal hero. But then came the revolutions of 1848, a wave of democratic uprisings across Europe. In Italy, Republicans and nationalists demanded an end to monarchy, foreign control, and yes, the Pope's political rule. And Pius? He panicked. He fled Rome in disguise, slipping out of the city dressed as an ordinary priest, while revolutionaries declared a short-lived Roman republic. For a moment, it looked like the Pope might become just a bishop again. But he had friends in high places. France sent troops. The Republic was crushed. The Pope returned, not softened, but hardened. Whatever liberal spark had lived in him died in exile. When he came back, he was not the same man. He abolished reforms, shut down parliaments, cracked down on dissent. The Vatican became a walled city in every sense. And in 1864, he published the Syllabus of Errors, a list of modern heresies, which included believing the Pope should not control the state, supporting secular education, advocating for democracy or religious pluralism. Basically, if you thought the world should change, Pius had a papal bull with your name on it. Mainstream historical fact? The Syllabus of Errors remains one of the most infamous documents in papal history, a manifesto of opposition to modernity, science, and secular governance. Quirky tidbit. Pius IX also officially defined the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854, not to be confused with the virgin birth. This teaching claimed that Mary herself was born without original sin. Theologians had debated it for centuries. Pius just declared it. And that wasn't his only declaration. In 1870, during the First Vatican Council, he pushed through the doctrine of papal infallibility. The idea that when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith or morals, the Pope cannot err. Let that sink in. A man under siege from the modern world, losing land, losing power, facing nationalist revolts, and his answer? I'm never wrong. It was bold. It was divisive. And it still stands in Catholic doctrine today. But even infallibility couldn't stop reality. Because that same year, 1870, Italian nationalists seized Rome. The last remnants of the Papal States were absorbed into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy. And Pope Pius IX? He locked himself in the Vatican, literally. He declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, refusing to step outside the walls. No meetings with the king, no public appearances. For the next 8 years, he ruled the church from within the tiny sovereign bubble of St. Peter's, physically inside Rome, but legally, nowhere. You walk through the hallways he once paced endlessly. The ceilings are lower here, the light filtered. There's a melancholy that clings to the wallpaper like incense to wood. Pius IX died in 1878, the longest-serving pope in history at that point. And his funeral? It nearly turned into a riot. As his coffin was paraded through Rome, angry nationalists attacked the procession. They tried to throw his body into the Tiber River. Only armed guards prevented them from succeeding. Historians still argue whether he was a tragic defender of faith or a stubborn reactionary who did more harm than good. Some Catholics still revere him as a saintly figure. In fact, in 2000, he was beatified, a step toward sainthood. Others, not so sure. He had refused to give up power gracefully, fought science, opposed modern freedoms. And yet, he'd held the church together through one of its greatest identity crises. You glance at the Vatican dome outside the window. It gleams in the sun. But behind that light is a long, flickering shadow, cast by Pius IX, a man who closed more doors than he opened. And yet, somehow, the papacy survived. You step down a staircase that spirals gently toward the archives. All these popes, each in their own way, left behind a trail of robes, relics, rumors, and regrets. Now it's time to follow that trail to its final chamber. Because the worst popes, they didn't just leave chaos behind. Somehow they left behind saints, shrines, and entire perfume lines. Yes, really. One last walk through the echoing halls of legacy. Next, the afterlives of history's worst popes. How the worst became honored, erased, or surprisingly well-scented. You're almost at the end now. But just when you think things might calm down, when the chaos might finally dissolve into footnotes, you find yourself in a softly lit corridor lined with velvet ropes, display cases, and reverent plaques. This isn't a throne room. It's a museum. And yet, behind the glass, you see objects that belong to men who probably shouldn't be anywhere near a shrine. Golden rings once slipped onto poisoned fingers, letters written with ink laced in deceit, even a pair of embroidered papal slippers rumored to have stepped over a corpse or two on the way to power. You've entered the Vatican's long, strange process of selective memory, where even the worst popes over time were reimagined, rehabilitated, or quietly swept under the rug. Welcome to the afterlives of history's worst popes. Let's start with a surprise, Pope Pius IX. You remember him, the man who locked himself in the Vatican, banned books, and said no to democracy like it was a personal insult? Well, he was beatified in the year 2000 by Pope John Paul II. That's right. The same man whose stubbornness helped lose the Papal States is now officially one miracle away from sainthood. It sparked massive controversy. Many Catholics applauded the decision. Others, especially Jewish communities, protested, pointing to Pius IX's enforcement of the Roman ghetto and his refusal to return a Jewish boy who had been secretly baptized and forcibly taken from his family. Historians still argue whether Pius was a spiritual visionary or a theocratic fossil, but sainthood has a way of smoothing over rough edges. You move to the next display. A shimmering case holds a letter written by Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. The same guy who hosted orgies, fathered multiple children, and allegedly poisoned guests at his dinner table. No sainthood here, but surprisingly no official condemnation either. In fact, his papal documents are still cited. His image? Still painted respectfully in some chapels. One modern historian even described him as a capable administrator who happened to have questionable taste in parties. That's one way to put it. But perhaps the strangest turn of all belongs to Pope Formosus. You remember him, right? The dead guy put on trial in a full corpse suit during the cadaver synod? Well, after being dug up, reburied, and dragged through the Tiber, he was eventually reburied again, this time with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. Centuries later, a small cult of reverence grew around him. Today, some even refer to him as a tragic martyr of politics, a pope who stood for righteousness and suffered posthumous injustice. Quirky tidbit: a niche line of luxury papal-themed perfumes once released a limited edition scent named Formosus Number. Deviati notes of myrrh, sandalwood, and what one reviewer called a faint trace of mold and vengeance. You can't make this up. You walk through a small, dim side gallery titled Contested Legacies. Inside are busts of Pope John XII, Benedict IX, Boniface VII, and Urban VI. No gold plaques. Just a tiny inscription at the bottom. History remembers what it chooses. Sometimes it forgives. Sometimes it forgets. And sometimes it puts everything on a shelf. You pause. Benedict IX, the pope who sold the papacy for cash, stares at you with blank marble eyes. His mouth carved open just slightly, almost like he's about to try and sell you something again. No beatification, no shrine, but no excommunication either. And that's the strange magic of the papacy. Even its most disgraced figures are rarely erased. They're absorbed, folded back into the folds of church history, like a difficult relative who still shows up in the family photo. Just maybe with some heavy retouching. You exit the gallery and step into an archive room. Stacks of documents tower on either side. Here, in the quiet hum of preservation, every scandal becomes ink. Every coup becomes footnote. Every absurdity eventually becomes tradition. Historians still argue over who the worst pope truly was. Was it the teenage libertine? The corpse prosecutor? The poisoner? The warmonger? The censor? But that question misses something deeper. Because the worst popes weren't just individual disasters. They were systems in collapse. Mirrors of their times. Products of greed, fear, ambition, and often complete lack of oversight. And yet, somehow, the church endured. You walk down the final corridor now. It's lined not with portraits, but with shadows. The faint outlines of men whose names are carved into history like graffiti into old stone. You pause at the exit, hand resting against a brass doorknob that's cool to the touch. You've walked through centuries of indulgence, war, scandal, shouting, and wine-stained vestments. And maybe, just maybe, you're starting to see that the papacy, like history itself, is less a beacon and more a bonfire. Beautiful, terrifying, flickering, never quite out. But wait, don't go yet. We're almost done. Now close your eyes. You're about to drift into the quiet, because after 15 chapters of chaos, it's time to rest. You're still now. The corridors have faded behind you. The whispers of long-dead popes, the rustle of papal robes brushing through candlelit halls, all gone. What remains is only silence. Cool, gentle silence. Outside Rome sleeps. The cobblestones that once echoed with armored boots and processions of silk-clad bishops now lie still beneath the stars. A soft breeze weaves through olive trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell sighs its final chime of the night. You're safe now. You've walked through scandals, through sieges, through dinner parties that ended in poison and debates that ended in fire. You've watched men crowned in splendor, stripped in disgrace, raised to sainthood, and sometimes buried in the Tiber. And somehow, through it all, the world kept spinning. You lie back now, the weight of history settling into a soft hush around you. Think of parchment curling under candlelight. Think of footsteps echoing in an empty basilica. Think of laughter, of fury, of prayers whispered not because they were heard, but because someone had to say them. The popes you've met tonight were flawed, messy, human in the most painfully human ways. But in that strange, stubborn humanity, there's something oddly comforting. Even the highest thrones are still just chairs. Even the most sacred voices can crack. Even the men in white can stumble through darkness. You exhale. The air is softer now, your thoughts slower. You let go of the scandals, the noise, the names. They can rest now. And so can you. Close your eyes. You made it. The worst of history is behind you. The night is long, the hum is low, and the past, no matter how loud, has finally gone quiet. Sleep well,